The weathered sign outside Broken Feather Ranch read simply, "Cook needed." 2 weeks it had stood there, baking under the Arizona sun. Inside, Thomas Blackhawk, the last of his Apache bloodline, stirred beans over a cook fire, his leathered face set in permanent lines of solitude. 30 years alone had suited him fine, or so he told himself. The distant sound of wagon wheels made him pause. Through the dusty window, he spotted not the grizzled ranch hand he expected, but 2 small figures in faded dresses, twin girls with identical braids and frightened eyes clutching a wrinkled newspaper clipping. Would these unexpected visitors finally heal the wounds a lifetime of loneliness had carved into his soul? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Arizona sky in fierce strokes of amber and crimson as Thomas Blackhawk stepped onto his porch. An eagle feather, worn smooth by decades of handling, twirled between his calloused fingers. His grandfather had given it to him as a boy, the last remaining symbol of a heritage that civilization had tried to erase. The coffee in his tin cup steamed into the cool morning air as his eyes swept across Broken Feather. Ranch, 6 horses grazed in the distance, 32 cattle scattered across the western pasture. He counted them daily, a ritual that anchored him to this patch of earth when memories threatened to pull him elsewhere. 58 years had carved deep lines into his copper face. 23 of those years belonged to the reservation, 5 to the jungles of Vietnam, and 30 to this isolated ranch. The math was simple, the memories complex. Thomas tucked the feather into his shirt pocket and descended the porch steps. His right knee protested, an old war injury that spoke louder with each passing winter. The doctor in town had recommended surgery years ago. Thomas had nodded politely and never returned. His boots crunched across the graveled path toward the barn where his daily chores awaited. The routine never changed. Feed the animals, check the fences, tend the small vegetable garden, hunt if necessary, repair what was broken. Silence was his constant companion, broken only by the wind, the animals, and occasionally his own voice when solitude grew too heavy. The locals called him the last Apache, a title that wasn't entirely accurate, but one he never corrected. His mother had been full-blooded Apache, his father half. The bloodline was thinning, like so many others. Sometimes Thomas wondered if he was preserving something important by living as he did, or simply hiding from a world that had taken too much from him. Inside the barn, he measured feed with practiced precision. The mare, a chestnut quarter horse named Whisper, nickered softly as he approached her stall. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The fall last winter had been a warning. 3 days trapped in his cabin with a broken ankle, feverish and unable to reach help. Only Hank's monthly supply run had saved him. The postmaster had found Thomas delirious. The fire long gone cold. "You need someone else out here," Hank had insisted while driving Thomas to the clinic. Thomas had stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar landscape blur past. "No one wants to work this far out, then advertise farther out," Hank had countered. That conversation had led to the sign, the advertisement. And now Thomas frowned as the memory of yesterday intruded, to 2 small children with identical faces staring up at him expectantly. He hadn't asked for children. He'd asked for a cook. Inside his cabin, tucked into a drawer beneath folded clothes, lay the bronze star the army had pinned on him in 1971. Sometimes he took it out, feeling its weight and remembering the man who'd earned it, a younger version of himself who still believed in things like country and brotherhood. That man would know what to do with orphaned children. That man wouldn't hesitate to help, but that man had died somewhere between the jungles of Vietnam and the isolation of this ranch. Breakfast was simple, cornmeal mush with honey, the last of yesterday's coffee reheated. Thomas ate standing at his kitchen counter, gaze fixed on the small guest room door. The twins were still sleeping, exhausted from their journey. Mrs. Holloway from the church organization had been clear. The girls had nowhere else to go except the state orphanage. Their grandmother, the woman who'd answered his advertisement, had died suddenly, leaving them alone. Their parents had perished in a house fire 3 years earlier, just until other arrangements can be made, she'd said firmly. 2 weeks at most, Thomas had reluctantly agreed, but only because the alternative, sending them back immediately, seemed unnecessarily cruel. 2 weeks. He could endure anything for 2 weeks. A small sound from the guest room made him stiffen. One of the girls was awake. Soon they would emerge with their identical braids and solemn eyes, looking to him for, what food? Comfort? Direction? He had no experience with children, no understanding of their needs beyond the basic necessities. He set his empty bowl in the basin and moved toward the door. The horses needed tending, fences needed checking, normal tasks on what promised to be anything but a normal day. The eagle feather in his pocket seemed suddenly heavier, a reminder of responsibilities beyond himself. His grandfather's voice echoed from memory, "We are never given burdens we cannot carry." Thomas wasn't so sure about that anymore. The battered metal mailbox at the end of Thomas's quarter-mile driveway had seen better days. Rust crept across its surface like a slow disease, and the red flag hung perpetually at half-mast, broken years ago during a monsoon season. Thomas rarely checked it more than once a month, having little use for the outside world's communications. Today, however, he found himself standing before it, watching the approaching dust cloud that signaled Hank Miller's monthly delivery. The postal truck bounced along the uneven road, finally pulling to a stop beside him. "Morning, Chief," Hank called through the open window, his weathered face creasing into a smile. Thomas nodded, never bothering to correct the nickname. Hank meant no harm by it, and Thomas had long ago stopped caring about such things. "Got your usual supplies?" Hank said, climbing out. "Plus something extra." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Responses," Hank explained, reaching into his bag. He pulled out a stack of envelopes. "To your advertisement." 7 of them, if you can believe it. Thomas took the letters reluctantly. "Probably all scammers." "Maybe," Hank conceded, hauling a box of supplies from the truck bed. "Or maybe one's your ticket to not dying alone in that cabin of yours." They walked in silence toward the house, the morning sun already intense at 9 o'clock. Hank, unlike most people, seemed comfortable with Thomas's taciturn nature. 20 years of monthly deliveries had established a rhythm between them. Not quite friendship, but something adjacent to it. Inside, Thomas placed the letters on the kitchen table, while Hank unloaded the supplies: flour, coffee, ammunition, kerosene, salt, sugar, and the few other necessities Thomas couldn't produce himself. "How's that knee?" Hank asked, nodding toward Thomas's right leg. "Fine. Sure it is." Hank's skepticism was evident. He'd been the one to find Thomas after his fall, after all. "That's why you finally agreed to get help around here," Thomas grunted, unwilling to concede the point, even though they both knew it was true. That long weekend, trapped feverish, wondering if he'd die alone, had finally convinced him that stubborn self-reliance had its limits. "You should put that ad in the Phoenix papers too," Hank suggested, settling into a chair. "Might get better responses." Thomas slid a cup of coffee across the table. It was part of their routine, coffee and 10 minutes of conversation before Hank continued his route. "Don't need the whole state knowing my business." Hank sipped his coffee, then set the cup down deliberately. "Got something else for you." "Not exactly mail." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a worn leather badge wallet, sliding it across the table. "Found this when I was cleaning out some old boxes." Thomas stared at the wallet but didn't touch it. "Belonged to your father, didn't it?" Hank asked. "Tribal police for what, 15 years?" Thomas nodded once, memories surfacing unwillingly. His father, stern, principled, killed in the line of duty when Thomas was 19. The badge wallet had disappeared during one of Thomas's many moves. "Where'd you get this?" "Sheriff Watson had it. Said your father saved his life once back in 59. Thought you might want it." Thomas finally picked up the wallet, feeling its familiar weight. Inside, the tarnished badge caught the morning light, and behind it a faded photo of his father in uniform. "Tell him thanks," Thomas said quietly. Tucking the wallet into his shirt pocket, Hank nodded, knowing better than to press the point. He finished his coffee and stood. "Better keep moving. Got 20 more stops today." At the door he paused. "By the way, one of those letters isn't a letter at all. Someone's coming in person. Next week, if I remember right." Thomas frowned. "Coming here?" "That's generally what in person means," Hank replied with a slight smile. "Holloway woman from the church. Said she represents somebody interested in the position." With that cryptic comment, Hank departed, leaving Thomas standing in the doorway with his father's badge in his pocket and a sense of unease settling over him like an approaching storm. The week that followed passed in familiar routine, though Thomas found himself watching the driveway more often than usual. The badge wallet remained in his pocket, a talisman connecting him to a past he'd tried to leave behind. On the 6th day, he opened the letters. 6 were indeed what he'd expected. People asking for money up front, details that didn't add up, handwriting too shaky to be trusted. The 7th was different, written in a precise feminine hand on cream-colored stationery. "Mr. Blackhawk, I am responding to your advertisement for a cook position. With 30 years of experience in household management and culinary arts, I believe I would be an asset to your establishment. I will arrive with references on the 15th. Respectfully, Margaret Wilson." Thomas read it twice, then placed it on the kitchen table. The 15th. Today. When the sound of an approaching vehicle reached him hours later, he was ready, or thought he was. Nothing could have prepared him for the sight of twin girls in identical blue dresses, clutching each other's hands as they stepped from Mrs. Holloway's car. His father's badge seemed suddenly heavy against his chest, a reminder of responsibilities inherited and avoided. A small wooden trunk with brass fittings sat on Thomas's porch, barely larger than a tackle box. Carved into its lid were 2 intertwined initials, M and P. It contained everything the twins owned in the world. Girls. "This is Mr. Blackhawk," Mrs. Holloway said, her hand firmly on each child's shoulder. "The man your grandmother was coming to work for." The twins stared up at Thomas with identical brown eyes set in heart-shaped faces. Their dark hair was plaited into neat braids, tied with faded blue ribbons that matched their dresses. 8 years old, according to Mrs. Holloway's hurried explanation, though they looked smaller to Thomas's inexperienced eye. "I'm Mia," said the one on the left, her voice surprisingly steady. A small scar above her right eyebrow distinguished her from her sister. "I'm Pia," whispered the other, partially hiding behind her sister. Thomas nodded stiffly, unsure what to say. Children had never factored into his plans. He'd asked for a cook, not a pair of orphans. "There's been a misunderstanding," he told Mrs. Holloway, stepping away from the twins. "I can't take care of children." Mrs. Holloway's pleasant expression didn't falter, but her eyes hardened slightly. "May I speak with you privately, Mr. Blackhawk?" Inside the cabin, her demeanor changed. "Their grandmother died 3 weeks ago. Heart attack. She was their only remaining family. I'm sorry for their loss," Thomas said, meaning it. "But I live alone for a reason. I've got no place for children here. And where exactly should they go?" Mrs. Holloway's voice was knife-sharp. "The state orphanage is overcrowded, with children sleeping on floors. Separated, the girls might find foster homes. Together?" She shook her head. "Nearly impossible." Thomas glanced through the window. The twins stood exactly where they'd been left, hands clasped together, the small trunk between them. They didn't fidget or explore as most children would. They simply waited, as if accustomed to having their fate decided by strangers. 2 weeks, Mrs. Holloway said. "Give them 2 weeks here while I search for alternatives. They're good girls. Their grandmother taught them to cook and clean. They won't be a burden." Thomas wanted to refuse. Every instinct told him to send them away. Children meant noise, questions, demands, everything he'd spent 30 years avoiding. 2 weeks, he finally agreed. "No longer." Relief flashed across Mrs. Holloway's face. "I'll check in regularly." "If there are any problems," "There won't be," Thomas interrupted. "Because they'll be gone in 2 weeks." When they returned to the porch, the twins hadn't moved an inch. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards. "Girls," Mrs. Holloway said gently. "Mr. Blackhawk has agreed to let you stay for a while. Remember what we discussed?" Both nodded solemnly. "Be helpful," Mia recited. "Be quiet," Pia added softly. "Be grateful," they finished together. Something in Thomas's chest tightened. They were too young to have such resignation in their voices. Mrs. Holloway kissed each girl on the forehead. "I'll return next week to check on you." To Thomas she added, "Their belongings are in the trunk. Their grandmother's letter about them is inside." After her departure, silence settled over the porch. The twins watched Thomas warily while he struggled to determine what came next. "You'll sleep in there," he finally said, gesturing to the small guest room. "There's only one bed. We share," Mia answered. "Always," Thomas nodded, relieved by one less problem to solve. "Are you hungry?" Another synchronized nod. He led them inside, conscious of how the cabin must appear to newcomers. The sparse furnishings, the utilitarian kitchen, the absence of anything decorative or comfortable. A man's space designed for a solitary existence. While Thomas heated beans and bacon on the stove, the twins sat at the table, their posture perfect, hands folded in their laps. They watched his every move with cautious interest. "Our grandmother was a good cook," Mia ventured after several minutes of silence. "She was teaching us. She made the best apple dumplings," Pia added, her voice warming with the memory. Thomas grunted noncommittally, unused to conversation during meals or any other time. After dinner, he showed them to the guest room. It was sparsely furnished, a double bed, a chair, a small dresser. The twins placed their trunk at the foot of the bed and began unpacking with quiet efficiency. Thomas started to leave, then paused in the doorway. From the trunk, Pia withdrew 2 identical stuffed rabbits, worn nearly bare in spots from years of handling. The only toys they'd brought, he realized. Perhaps the only ones they owned. "We'll stay out of your way," Mia promised, catching his gaze. "Grandmother said men like quiet." Thomas stood there, momentarily speechless. Children shouldn't understand such things, shouldn't modify themselves to accommodate adult preferences. "Get some rest," he finally said. "Morning comes early here." Later, from his chair on the porch, Thomas heard them through the partially open window. Whispered conversations, occasional giggles, the creak of the bed as they settled, then unexpected, soft singing. 2 perfectly matched voices in a lullaby about stars and wishes and safe journeys home. Thomas closed his eyes, allowing the song to wash over him. For the first time in decades, his cabin held something besides silence. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. The sun had barely crested the eastern mountains when Thomas woke to unfamiliar sounds in his kitchen. Soft clattering, whispered instructions, the gentle closing of cupboard doors. For a moment he lay still, disoriented, until memory returned. The twins, his reluctant agreement, 2 weeks of disruption to endure. He dressed quickly and moved down the hallway, pausing at the kitchen entrance. The scene before him was one of focused chaos. A cast-iron skillet tilted precariously on the stove. Flour dusted the countertops like fresh snow. Between the mess stood Mia and Pia, their braids now slightly askew. Their nightgowns, protected by kitchen towels, tied around their waists as makeshift aprons. On the table sat an ornate wooden spoon, its handle carved with delicate flowers and vines. Mia carefully stirred batter in a bowl while consulting the spoon, as if it contained secret instructions. Grandmother said 3 times clockwise, then once counterclockwise. She instructed her sister. "For luck." Pia nodded solemnly, adjusting the heat on the stove with determined concentration. Thomas cleared his throat. Both girls startled, Mia nearly dropping the bowl. "What's happening here?" he asked, surveying the disaster zone that had been his orderly kitchen. "Breakfast," Mia answered, recovering quickly. "Grandmother said a cook earns her keep," Thomas frowned. "I didn't ask you to cook." "You needed a cook," Pia said softly, her eyes earnest. That's what the sign said." "I needed an adult cook," Thomas clarified, moving toward the stove to prevent whatever was in the skillet from burning. "Not children." The twins exchanged a glance that contained an entire conversation. Their silent communication unnerved Thomas. It was too intimate, too exclusionary. "We're very good helpers," Mia insisted. Grandmother taught us everything. Thomas removed the skillet from the heat, revealing a blackened mass that might once have been intended as pancakes. The acrid smell of burnt batter filled the kitchen. "I can see that," he said dryly. Mia's determined expression faltered. Pia's lower lip trembled slightly. "We wanted to help," Pia whispered, staring at the ruined breakfast. Thomas felt a twinge of something unfamiliar. Guilt, perhaps. He'd been sharp with them, when they'd only been trying to be useful. Still, they needed to understand the boundaries. "In this house," he said more evenly, "we wait for instructions before doing things, understand?" They nodded in unison, shoulders slumping. "Now help me clean this up. Then I'll make breakfast." The girls attacked the mess with the same focused energy they'd applied to cooking. Thomas observed their efficiency with reluctant approval. They worked well together, anticipating each other's movements in a practiced dance of cooperation. While frying bacon and eggs, a simple meal without room for creative disaster, Thomas established the ground rules. "You'll sleep in your room. Meals at 6, noon and 6. No wandering off. No touching tools or equipment without permission. No bothering the livestock." The twins absorbed each instruction with solemn attention. "What can we do?" Mia finally asked. The question caught Thomas off guard. He'd been focused on restrictions, not permissions. "Keep your room tidy," he said after a moment's consideration. "Help with dishes. Simple things." "We can do more," Mia persisted. "Grandmother taught us to sweep and dust and sort things." Thomas set plates before them. "We'll see." Breakfast passed in silence. The twins ate neatly but hungrily, occasionally exchanging their mysterious glances. Thomas found their synchronized movements unsettling, the way they both reached for water at the same moment, how they finished eating within seconds of each other. "What was that spoon you were using?" Thomas asked abruptly, curiosity overcoming his preference for quiet. Mia looked up, surprised by the question. "Grandmother's teaching spoon. She carved it herself. For special recipes," Pia added. "It has measurements marked inside the bowl. And luck," Mia finished. Thomas nodded, not knowing what else to say. The concept of a family heirloom was foreign to him. He'd carried nothing from his past into his present. After breakfast, Thomas faced his first real dilemma. His daily routine required him to check the north pasture fence, but he couldn't leave the twins alone. Taking them along seemed equally problematic. "Can you entertain yourselves quietly for a few hours?" he asked, hoping for a simple solution. "We brought books," Mia answered. "And mending." "Mending?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "For socks and things," Pia explained. "Grandmother taught us." Their constant references to their grandmother reinforced their loss. These children had been raised by a woman who taught them practical skills and family traditions. Now they sat in a stranger's kitchen, trying to apply those lessons in an environment that offered no welcome. Thomas felt another unfamiliar twinge. Not quite sympathy, he'd buried that emotion long ago, but something adjacent to it. "I'll be back by noon," he said finally. "Stay in the house. Don't touch anything." They finished together. Thomas nodded and left, feeling oddly as if he were the one being dismissed. In the barn, preparing his horse, Thomas found himself working faster than usual. The morning quiet, once cherished, now felt vaguely unsettling. He caught himself straining to hear the cabin, to detect signs of mischief or distress. This, he reminded himself, was exactly why solitude had been his choice for 30 years. Other people complicated everything, even the simplest morning routine. As he rode out, Thomas glanced back at the cabin. Through the kitchen window, he could see two small figures already at work with broom and dustcloth, industrious as ants in their new environment. 2 weeks suddenly felt much longer than he'd initially calculated. Thomas returned from the north pasture to find the cabin transformed. Floors swept, surfaces dusted, dishes washed and put away with military precision. Even his boots by the door had been neatly arranged, the dried mud brushed away. The scent of pine soap replaced the usual mustiness. More surprising was the pantry. Thomas stopped short in the doorway, momentarily speechless. His haphazard collection of canned goods, flour sacks and dried herbs now stood in organized rows. Labels faced forward, similar items grouped together. A small chalkboard hung on the inside of the door with a careful inventory written in a child's practice script. "We found it in the trunk," Mia explained, appearing silently beside him. "Grandmother always kept inventory," Thomas grunted, unsure whether to be impressed or annoyed by this invasion of his chaotic but familiar system. "You can find things faster now," she added, misinterpreting his silence as disapproval. Before Thomas could respond, a sound from outside caught his attention. Not quite a song, not quite a hum, but something melodic and soothing. He moved to the window. In the side yard near the barn, Pia stood beside the corral, making that strange sound while holding something in her outstretched palm. "What is she doing?" he asked sharply. Mia joined him at the window. "Talking to the horses," she answered, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Thomas watched as his newest acquisition, a half-wild Mustang he'd been struggling to approach for weeks, stretched its neck cautiously toward Pia's small hand. "That horse is dangerous," he said, already moving toward the door. Mia caught his sleeve, her grip surprisingly strong for such a small hand. "She won't hurt it." "I'm worried about it hurting her," Thomas replied, pulling away. Outside he approached carefully, not wanting to startle either child or horse. Pia continued her strange humming, seemingly oblivious to his approach. The Mustang, a sure, dappled grey with a scarred flank that told tales of rough handling, had lowered its head almost to the girl's level. In Pia's outstretched hand lay a single turquoise bead glinting in the sunlight. The horse sniffed it curiously, then gently took the apple slice beneath it from her palm. "He was hungry," Pia said without turning around, "and lonely." Thomas stopped a few feet away. "How do you know it's a he?" "He told me," she answered simply. The horse, which had pulled away slightly at Thomas's approach, now returned its attention to Pia, nickering softly. She resumed her melodic humming, reaching up to stroke its scarred muzzle. "Where did you get that bead?" Thomas asked. "Grandmother's medicine pouch," Pia replied, "for making friends with wild things." Thomas watched, fascinated despite himself, as the girl worked small fingers through the Mustang's tangled mane. The horse that had repeatedly tried to kick him now stood docile as a pony at a children's fair. "His name is Thunder," Pia announced. "I call him Grey," Thomas countered. Pia shook her head, her expression suddenly serious. "That's not his true name. His true name is Thunder." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. His mother had spoken of true names. The Apache belief that discovering something's true name gave you a connection to its spirit. How did this child know of such things? "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, changing the subject. "I told you to stay inside." "Mia knew where I was," Pia answered, as if that settled everything. "That's not," Thomas began, then stopped as the horse pushed its head against Pia's small chest, nearly knocking her over. Yet there was gentleness in the gesture, like a dog seeking affection from its master. "He likes me," Pia said, smiling properly for the first time since her arrival. Thomas found himself unable to maintain his stern demeanor in the face of that smile. "Finish up here and come inside. Lunch soon." Back in the kitchen, he found Mia, setting the table with a precision that would have satisfied a military inspector. "Your sister has a way with horses," Thomas observed, washing up at the sink. "Pia has a way with all animals," Mia responded matter-of-factly. "I'm better with people and things." She gestured to the organized kitchen. "We're different that way." Thomas considered this as he assembled a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried venison. He'd assumed the twins were identical in all ways, interchangeable. The realization that they had distinct talents and personalities made them suddenly more real, more individual. Pia returned, bringing with her the earthy scent of horse and hay. Her face glowed with quiet joy. "Thunder says thank you for saving him from the men who hurt him," she announced as she washed her hands. Thomas stared at her. He'd found the Mustang 3 weeks ago at a remote trading post, being roughly handled by traders who saw it as nothing but trouble. The purchase had been impulsive, driven by something he hadn't examined too closely. "How did you know that?" he asked. Pia shrugged, taking her place at the table. "He showed me the pictures in his mind." Thomas glanced at Mia, expecting her to roll her eyes at her sister's fanciful statement. Instead, she nodded in confirmation, as if Pia's declaration was entirely reasonable. During lunch, Thomas found himself watching the twins with new interest. Beneath their identical exteriors were two distinct personalities. Mia, practical and organized. Pia, intuitive and dreamy. Together, they formed a complementary whole, each completing what the other lacked. For the first time, Thomas wondered what would happen to them after the 2 weeks ended. Would they be separated in the state orphanage? The thought was suddenly, unexpectedly troubling. The turquoise bead now hung on a string around Pia's neck, a splash of color against her plain dress. A talisman, Thomas thought. A connection to something larger than herself. Perhaps that's what the twins were doing. Here, creating connections where none had existed before. Morning, dew still sparkled on the grass as Thomas instructed the twins in repairing the split rail fence near the eastern pasture. His calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency, demonstrating how to check each rail for integrity before setting it in place. Between them lay a worn leather tool belt, its compartments holding a collection of hand-carved wooden pegs of varying sizes. "My father made these," Thomas explained, selecting a peg from the belt. "No nails. Apache way. Wood joins to wood." The girls watched intently, Mia absorbing the technical details, while Pia ran her fingers along the grain of an old rail, seemingly listening to something only she could hear. "Why not use nails?" Mia asked, practical as always. Thomas tapped a completed joint. "Wood breathes. Moves with seasons. Nails work loose. These pegs swell and shrink with the wood." Stronger, it had been 5 days since the twins' arrival. 5 days of adjusting routines, of discovering their habits and capabilities. Against his better judgment, Thomas had begun including them in simple ranch tasks, finding that idle hands led to uncomfortable questions about his past, his people, his solitary life. "Can I try?" Mia asked, pointing to the mallet in Thomas's hand. He hesitated, then nodded, showing her how to hold it properly for her small grip. Gentle at first, then firm. Mia's face scrunched in concentration as she tapped the peg into the pre-drilled hole. Thomas fought the urge to take over, forcing himself to let her learn through doing. When the peg finally seated correctly, a rare smile of approval crossed his face. "Good," he said simply. Mia beamed at the praise, immediately reaching for another rail. "I want to do more." "Me too," Pia added, though Thomas noticed her attention had drifted to a hawk circling overhead. "1 section each," Thomas agreed. "But stay where I can see you. This pasture borders Morrison's land. Don't cross the boundary. What's over there?" Pia asked, shading her eyes to peer across the invisible property line. "Nothing for children," Thomas answered firmly. The truth was more complicated. Jed Morrison was the kind of neighbor best avoided, quick-tempered, territorial, with outdated views on Native Americans that he expressed freely after a few drinks in town. Thomas hadn't spoken more than 10 words to the man in 15 years, which suited them both. For an hour, they worked steadily, the fence taking shape under their combined efforts. Thomas found himself surprisingly impressed by the twins' diligence. Mia approached each task methodically, while Pia seemed to intuit which rails fit best together, rarely needing to try different combinations. "Your father taught you this?" Mia asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Thomas nodded, memories surfacing. "When I was young, Before he died, our father built things too, Pia offered quietly. Before the fire. The mention of the fire, the first time either girl had referenced their parents' death, hung in the air between them. Thomas didn't know what to say, how to acknowledge their loss without inviting further conversation about his own painful memories. "Water break," he said instead, retrieving a canteen from nearby. While they drank, Thomas surveyed their progress. Another hour would complete this section. Then perhaps he could teach them about checking the irrigation ditches for the small vegetable garden. Simple tasks that kept hands busy and minds occupied. A movement in his peripheral vision made him turn. Pia was no longer beside them. Scanning quickly, he spotted her small figure heading toward the ravine that marked the property boundary, following something he couldn't see. "Pia!" he called sharply. "Stop there!" Either she didn't hear or chose to ignore him. She continued toward the ravine, where a steep 30-foot drop awaited the unwary. "Stay here," he ordered Mia, already striding toward her sister. Pia had reached the edge of the ravine when Thomas caught up to her, grabbing her arm and pulling her back with more force than he'd intended. She stumbled, looking up at him with startled eyes. "What did I tell you?" he demanded, fear making his voice harsh. "No wandering off. That drop could kill you." "The rabbit had babies," Pia said, pointing to a nearly invisible nest tucked into the ravine's edge. "She was asking for help. Something's wrong with one of them. I don't care if the president himself was calling you," Thomas snapped. "When I give an order, you obey it. Understand?" Tears welled in Pia's eyes. She nodded once, then pulled free of his grip and ran back toward her sister, braids flying behind her. Thomas stood there, frustration and residual fear coursing through him. Children didn't understand danger. They didn't comprehend how quickly life could turn. One misstep, one moment of inattention. When he returned to the fence, both girls were sitting silently on a log, Mia's arm protectively around Pia's shoulders. The companionable atmosphere had vanished, replaced by wary silence. "The ravine is dangerous," Thomas said, his voice deliberately calmer. 30 feet straight down to rocks. "Even adults stay clear of the edge," neither twin responded. Mia's expression was carefully neutral, but Pia stared at the ground, her earlier enthusiasm extinguished. Thomas sighed inwardly. He'd frightened them, Pia with his anger, and likely Mia with the realization that they were still unwelcome guests who could be sent away for misbehavior. "The rabbit nest," he said finally. "What's wrong with it?" Pia looked up, surprise replacing hurt in her eyes. "One baby is smaller. Not getting milk." Thomas considered this. "Tomorrow we'll bring some eyedropper and goat milk. See if we can help. But only if you promise to never go near that edge alone." The transformation in Pia's expression was immediate, like sunshine breaking through clouds. "I promise," she whispered. "Both of you," Thomas insisted, looking at Mia. "We promise," they answered in unison. As they resumed work on the fence, Thomas noticed the tension gradually dissipating. By the time they returned to the cabin for lunch, the twins were once again working in their synchronized harmony, though somewhat subdued. Later, passing their room after dinner, Thomas overheard their whispered conversation. "Should we try to leave?" Pia asked. "And go where?" Mia replied practically. "We have nowhere else. He doesn't want us. He's just not used to children." "Grandmother said men take time to warm up, like bread dough," Pia agreed, her voice thoughtful. "Maybe he just needs more rising time." Thomas moved away from the door, something tightening in his chest. The simple insight of children, comparing him to bread dough in need of patience. They understood more than he'd given them credit for. The leather tool belt hung on its peg by the door, his father's craftsmanship a daily reminder of lessons passed down through generations. Perhaps there were other things that needed passing on before they were lost forever. Static crackled through the old transistor radio as Thomas adjusted its antenna, searching for a clear signal. The battered device, olive green with chrome dials worn smooth from decades of use, had been his companion since Vietnam. It rarely saw use these days, except during monsoon season, when weather reports became a necessity rather than a curiosity. "More to the left," Mia suggested, watching his efforts with interest. Thomas tilted the antenna slightly, and suddenly a voice emerged from the static. Advisory for Apache County. National Weather Service is tracking a severe system moving eastward from Navajo County. Expected rainfall of 4 to 6 inches over the next 36 hours, with potential flash flooding in low-lying areas. Residents are advised to... Thomas switched off the radio, having heard enough. Big storm coming, he announced, looking at the twins. We need to prepare. Outside, the sky remained deceptively clear, but Thomas recognized the telltale signs: the sudden drop in temperature, the birds gone quiet, the restless movements of the livestock. He'd weathered enough Arizona monsoons to read the warnings. What do we do? Mia asked, already rolling up her sleeves, ready for instructions. Everything that can move needs to be secured. Everything that can't needs to be protected. Thomas surveyed the ranch with a practiced eye. Lot of work before sundown. For the next several hours they worked steadily. The twins proved surprisingly helpful, following Thomas's instructions without complaint. Mia organized supplies in the storm cellar, while Pia helped move the smaller livestock to sheltered areas. Thomas handled the heavier tasks, boarding windows, securing loose roofing on the barn, moving equipment to higher ground. By late afternoon, dark clouds had begun to gather along the western horizon. The air felt heavy with impending rainfall. Will the animals be scared? Pia asked, as they led the last of the chickens into the reinforced coop. They know what to do, Thomas answered. Animals understand storms better than people do. Pia nodded thoughtfully. Thunder says he wants to be in the barn, not the corral. Thomas had stopped questioning how Pia seemed to know what animals wanted. After the incident with the rabbit nest, where her assessment of the runtkit's condition had proved accurate, he'd developed a grudging respect for her unusual intuition. Tell Thunder he'll be in the barn with the others, he said, no longer feeling foolish for addressing the Mustang by the name Pia had given him. As they finished the preparations, the wind began to pick up, carrying the distant scent of rain. Thomas checked his watch. A few hours of daylight remained, enough time to secure the final details. One more thing, he told the twins. We need to clear the irrigation ditches so the water has somewhere to go. They worked together, clearing debris from the network of shallow channels that Thomas had dug years ago to direct water away from the cabin and barn. As they worked, the radio's weather warning proved accurate. The storm front approached with impressive speed. Dark clouds now dominating the western sky. Almost done, Thomas encouraged, noting the twins' tired faces. Just this last stretch. A distant rumble of thunder made Pia freeze, her eyes widening with sudden fear. It's still far, Thomas assured her. We have time. But the next thunderclap came noticeably closer, followed by a sharp gust of wind that nearly knocked Mia off her feet. Thomas made a quick decision. Inside, now. They barely made it to the cabin before the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, the gentle patter became a roaring downpour, water streaming down the windows and drumming against the roof with incredible force. Will the roof hold? Mia asked, watching a small leak form in the corner of the kitchen. Always has, Thomas answered, placing a pot under the drip. Though it might complain about it, the storm's intensity increased as darkness fell. Wind howled around the cabin's corners, finding every crack and crevice. Thunder crashed overhead, each boom making the twins inch closer together on the small sofa. Thomas lit kerosene lamps, expecting the power to fail. Sure enough, after a particularly violent thunderclap, the electric lights flickered and died. Does this happen often? Mia asked, her usual composure slipping as the cabin creaked ominously. Few times a year, Thomas replied, stoking the fire in the wood stove. Worst is usually over by morning. Another thunderclap, this one directly overhead, rattled the windows. Pia let out a small whimper, pressing herself against her sister. Thomas noticed her white-knuckled grip on the sofa cushion. My mother had a saying about storms, he found himself saying. She called thunder the sky speaking, said we should listen to what it tells us. The twins looked at him with identical expressions of curiosity, momentarily distracted from their fear. What does it tell us? Napier asked. Thomas hesitated. He rarely spoke of his mother or her teachings. Those memories belonged to a different life, one he'd deliberately left behind. Yet something about the twins' expectant faces in the lamplight pushed him to continue. She said, "Thunder reminds us that we're small but not forgotten. That the same forces that can destroy can also bring new life." As if in response, rain began to seep under the door, forming a small puddle on the floor. "I'll get that," Mia said, already moving to find a towel. "No," Thomas stopped her. "I'll handle it. You two should get some sleep if you can." But one look at their tense faces told him sleep was unlikely. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. The night stretched ahead, long and potentially frightening for children unused to the violent weather of the high desert. Thomas glanced at his mother's radio on the table, a relic from a time when he'd still embraced his heritage and family connections. Perhaps there were other relics worth retrieving from memory. "If you can't sleep," he said slowly, "I could tell you how my people explain where storms come from." The twins' faces brightened simultaneously. "Yes, please," they answered in unison, as the storm raged outside. Thomas found himself doing something he hadn't done in 30 years, sharing the stories his mother had once shared with him, keeping cultural embers alive for a new generation, even if they weren't of his blood. And somehow, as the night deepened and the storm gradually moved eastward, the cabin felt less like a fortress against the world and more like what it had originally been intended to be: a home. Dawn revealed a transformed landscape. Water pooled in the low spots of the yard, reflecting the pale morning sky. Branches and debris scattered across the property like discarded toys. The storm had passed, but its effects remained, a reminder of nature's raw power. Thomas stood on the porch assessing the damage. The barn roof had lost a few shingles, but the structure remained sound. The irrigation ditches had done their job, diverting the worst of the flooding away from the buildings. Overall, they had weathered the storm well. "Is it safe to come out?" Mia asked from the doorway, Pia peering around her shoulder. Thomas nodded. Storms moved on east. The twins stepped onto the porch, their expressions a mixture of wariness and wonder at the changed world before them. "The garden," Pia said suddenly, pointing toward the small vegetable patch. Thomas followed her gaze, wincing as he saw the flattened plants and muddy rows. Weeks of work washed away in a single night. "We can fix it," Mia declared, with her characteristic practicality. "Grandmother's garden flooded once, and we replanted everything." "Some things," Thomas corrected. Too late in the season for others. The three of them walked the property, cataloguing damage and making mental lists of repairs. The twins stayed close to Thomas, occasionally pointing out things he might have missed: a chicken coop door hanging by one hinge, a section of fence submerged in muddy water. Near the barn, Pia stopped abruptly, her head tilted as if listening. Without a word, she changed direction, heading toward a fallen cottonwood branch. Crouching down, she gently lifted something from beneath it. "Look," she called softly. Thomas and Mia joined her. In Pia's cupped hands lay a tiny, soaked desert cottontail. Its breathing rapid and shallow, one leg clearly injured. "It needs help," Pia said, looking up at Thomas with pleading eyes. Thomas almost refused automatically. Wild animals rarely survived human intervention, but something in Pia's expression stopped him. The compassion there mirrored his mother's, who had never turned away from a creature in need. "Bring it inside," he said finally. "We'll see what can be done." Back in the cabin, Thomas retrieved a small wooden box from a high shelf in his room. Carefully carved with intricate geometric patterns, the box had remained untouched for years. He opened it now, revealing a collection of small tools, dried herbs and tightly wrapped packages, his mother's healing kit. "What is that?" Mia asked, watching as Thomas laid out the contents on the kitchen table. "Medicine box," he answered. "My mother was a healer." From one package, Thomas withdrew a length of thin, flexible wood, perfect for splinting the rabbit's leg. From another, he took dried herbs that, when steeped in hot water, would create a paste to reduce swelling. "Will it help?" Pia asked anxiously, still cradling the injured cottontail. "We'll try," Thomas said. unwilling to make promises he couldn't keep. As he worked on the tiny creature, Thomas found himself remembering his mother's hands guiding his own, teaching him the proper way to bind wounds and apply medicines. Knowledge he had thought forgotten emerged from memory, as fresh as if she'd taught him yesterday instead of 40 years ago. The twins watched intently, asking questions that Thomas answered with surprising patience. When the rabbit's leg was finally splinted and the animal resting in a makeshift nest of soft cloth, Thomas looked up to find both girls studying him with new eyes. "You've done this before," Mia observed. Thomas nodded, carefully returning the unused items to the medicine box. "Long ago. Why did you stop?" Mia asked with a child's directness. The question caught Thomas off guard. He'd never articulated even to himself why he'd abandoned so many of his mother's teachings. After her death, after Vietnam, after the loss of his wife and unborn child, he'd sealed away those parts of himself that connected him to others, both the skills and the memories they carried. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "it's easier not to remember." The twins seemed to consider this, exchanging one of their silent glances. "But then you forget the good parts too," Mia said finally. Out of the mouths of children, Thomas thought. A truth so simple he'd spent 30 years avoiding it. After a small lunch, they ventured out again to begin repairs. The twins insisted on helping, despite Thomas's suggestion that they rest after the long, frightening night. "We're stronger together," Mia explained matter-of-factly as she handed him nails for the chicken coop. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds began gathering again on the horizon. Thomas eyed them warily. "Another storm coming," he announced. "We better get inside." This second wave hit with less fury but greater persistence. Rain fell steadily throughout the evening, punctuated by occasional thunder. The power remained out, leaving them once again in the warm glow of kerosene lamps. After dinner, simple sandwiches made with the last of the bread, Thomas noticed the twins growing restless in the confined space. Normally chatty with each other, they had fallen into an unusual silence that filled the cabin more completely than their conversations ever had. Thomas went to his bedroom and returned with something tucked under his arm, a blanket woven in rich reds, blues, and blacks, its geometric pattern telling stories to those who knew how to read them. "My grandmother made this," he said, spreading it before the fire, "for storytelling nights." The twins moved closer, drawn by the blanket's vivid colors and intricate design. "Each pattern has meaning," Thomas explained, tracing a zigzag line that ran through the center. "This one tells the story of first man's journey through the mountains. Will you tell us?" Pia asked, settling onto the blanket with reverent care. Thomas hesitated only briefly before sitting cross-legged on the blanket's edge. "My grandmother would say it's the right night for old stories. When the rain speaks to the roof and the fire speaks to the hearth." As the storm continued its steady percussion on the cabin roof, Thomas began sharing legends he'd thought forgotten, stories of creation and transformation, of animal people and star beings. The twins listened with rapt attention, their earlier fear of the storm forgotten in the magic of the tales. When he finally fell silent, the cabin felt different somehow, filled with something beyond the physical presence of three people, as if the stories themselves had taken up residence in the spaces between them. "Our grandmother told stories too," Mia offered quietly. "But different ones. Will you tell me sometime?" Thomas asked. The twins nodded, something like hope brightening their expressions. That night, checking on the injured rabbit before bed, Thomas found himself humming one of his mother's healing songs, a melody he hadn't thought of in decades. The simple tune came easily to his lips, as if it had been waiting all these years for the right moment to emerge. In the small nest, the cottontail's breathing had steadied, its tiny body curled in peaceful sleep. The storm had depleted their supplies faster than anticipated. 1 week after the twins' arrival, Thomas found himself facing an unwelcome necessity, a trip to town with the girls in tow. He'd avoided town visits during their stay, sending Hank with a list when the postman made his rounds. But the extensive storm damage had created needs that couldn't wait for Hank's next scheduled delivery. "We're going to town," Thomas announced over breakfast, watching their reactions carefully. "Just for supplies." "Quick trip." The twins exchanged one of their communicative glances before Mia asked, "Can we wear our Sunday dresses?" Thomas nodded, relieved by their apparent eagerness. He'd half expected resistance, given their previous life circumstances. But children were surprisingly adaptable, he was learning. The drive into Cooperton took 40 minutes along winding dirt roads still muddy from the recent downpours. Thomas's old truck protested the conditions, but maintained a steady pace. In the passenger seat, the twins sat pressed together, taking up barely more space than a single adult. They'd emerged from their room in identical blue dresses with white collars, their hair neatly braided, looking like something from a previous era. "Remember," Thomas instructed as they approached the town limits, "stay close, no wandering off." Cooperton barely qualified as a town, just a main street with essential businesses, a church, and scattered houses. Most residents lived on surrounding ranches and farms, coming to town only when necessary. Thomas normally appreciated the community's respectful distance, the way they acknowledged him with nods, but rarely attempted conversation. Today, he wondered how they would react to the twins. He parked in front of Wilson's General Store, which occupied a prominent corner of Main Street. Through the large front window, Thomas could see several customers inside, more than he'd hoped for on a weekday morning. "Here we go," he muttered, more to himself than to the girls. Inside, conversations paused momentarily as the trio entered. Thomas felt the weight of curious stares, the quick assessments being made. He nodded curtly to Sam Wilson behind the counter and headed for the hardware section, the twins following close behind. "Thomas Blackhawk," came a female voice to his left. "Heard you had company these days." Edith Palmer, the town's self-appointed gossip coordinator, stood beside the dry goods, her expression eager beneath her polite smile. In her hands, she held the store's worn leather-bound ledger, where she recorded not just purchases, but also the comings and goings of local residents, an unofficial town chronicle. "Mrs. Palmer," Thomas acknowledged with minimal courtesy. Her gaze shifted to the twins, who stood partially hidden behind him. "And these must be the little orphan girls. My, aren't they identical? Like two peas in a pod." Thomas stepped slightly to block her view, uncomfortable with her scrutiny of the children. "Just getting supplies today." Of course, Edith nodded but made no move to leave. "Such a generous thing you're doing, taking them in like that. Temporary, I understand?" The question hung in the air, laden with unspoken implications. Thomas felt a small hand slip into his. Pia's, he realized without looking. Her fingers were cold. "We need nails, lumber, and feed," Thomas told Mrs. Palmer flatly. "Plus regular supplies." Edith finally took the hint, though her disappointment was evident. "Sam will help you with all that." "Good to see you in town, girls," she added, before moving away to continue her documentarian duties elsewhere in the store. Thomas felt Pia's grip relax slightly. He squeezed her hand once before releasing it, a gesture that surprised him as much as it seemed to comfort her. As they moved through the store gathering supplies, Thomas became increasingly aware of the whispered conversations, the sidelong glances. When Mia and Pia went to examine the small selection of penny candy, a treat Thomas had impulsively offered, he overheard two ranchers by the seed display. "Ain't natural," one murmured. "Those girls are white as snow." "Should be with their own kind. Heard the states involved," the other replied. "Temporary arrangement. Better be. Remember what happened with the Morales boy back in '82? That Apache fella on the reservation who took him in. Boy wasn't right after talking about spirits and such." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he kept his focus on selecting the items they needed. He'd long ago learned that confrontation only reinforced prejudice. Still, hearing such talk about the twins, two children who'd already lost so much, kindled a protective anger he hadn't felt in years. At the counter, Sam Wilson tallied their purchases with professional efficiency. "Quite a storm we had," he commented, carefully avoiding the topic of the twins, who were examining a display of colorful hair ribbons nearby. Bad enough, Thomas agreed.
Lost part of the barn roof. Sam nodded sympathetically.
Folks west of here got hit worse. Henderson's lost their entire crop. As Sam packaged their supplies, Sheriff Watson entered the store. His gaze immediately found Thomas and the twins, his expression unreadable beneath his mustache. After a moment's consideration, he approached. "Black Hawk," he greeted, tipping his hat. "These the girls I've been hearing about?" Thomas nodded, noting how the twins pressed closer together under the sheriff's scrutiny. "Girls, this is Sheriff Watson," Thomas introduced them, keeping his tone neutral. "Sheriff, this is Mia and Pia Wilson." "Wilson," the sheriff repeated, something flickering in his eyes. "Any relation to Margaret Wilson from over Tucson way?" "Our grandmother," Mia answered quietly. The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "Sorry for your loss. She was well respected." After an awkward pause, the sheriff moved closer to Thomas, lowering his voice. "Might have a word outside when you're finished here?" Thomas nodded, a sense of foreboding settling over him. Outside, with the twins instructed to wait in the truck, Sheriff Watson didn't waste time on pleasantries. "People are talking." "Thomas, people always talk," the sheriff sighed. "This is different. 2 white orphan girls living with—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at Thomas. "With an Apache," Thomas finished flatly. "You know how folks are. Especially after what happened with the church mission school last year." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Just saying, might be best for everyone if this arrangement stays temporary, like Mrs. Holloway indicated." Thomas felt something harden inside him. The sheriff wasn't being deliberately cruel, just pragmatic according to the community's standards. But looking at the twins, waiting in his truck, their solemn faces watching through the window, Thomas found himself unwilling to simply accept those standards. "Those girls have nowhere else to go," he said finally. "There's the state home in—" "Phoenix," the sheriff suggested. "Where?" "They'd be separated," Thomas countered. "They've lost everyone else." "Would you take that from them too?" The sheriff raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Just passing along concerns, Thomas. No official business yet?" The implied warning wasn't subtle. Thomas loaded the supplies in silence, aware of the eyes watching from the store windows, from the barbershop across the street, from the cafe on the corner. Hooperton was observing, judging, reaching conclusions. As they drove out of town, the twins remained unusually quiet. Finally, as the last buildings receded behind them, Pia asked in a small voice, "Why was everyone looking at us funny?" Thomas gripped the steering wheel tighter. "People don't always understand things that are different." "Different how?" Mia pressed, her practical nature demanding concrete answers. Thomas considered his words carefully. "Some people think families should all look the same. All white together or all Apache together. But we're not a family," Pia said, confusion in her voice. "Are we?" The question caught Thomas off guard. What were they? A temporary arrangement, as everyone kept saying? Or something else forming, something without a simple name? "We're—" he began, then faltered. "We're what we need to be for now." It wasn't a satisfying answer, he knew, but it was the only honest one he could give. As they turned onto the long drive leading to the ranch, Thomas found himself thinking about the ledger book Mrs. Palmer had been holding, recording not just the town's purchases, but its judgments, its boundaries, its unwritten rules about who belonged with whom. Some boundaries, he was beginning to realize, deserved to be questioned. The morning of the 2-week deadline dawned clear and cool. Thomas had been awake since before sunrise, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the eastern sky lighten. The mug in his hands bore a child's careful artwork, a crude rendering of 3 stick figures standing beside what appeared to be a house. "Our home" was written across the bottom in Mia's meticulous handwriting. The twins had presented it to him yesterday, having discovered a box of forgotten paints in a cupboard. Their faces had been a mixture of pride and apprehension as they'd handed over their creation. Thomas had accepted it wordlessly, not trusting himself to speak. Now he traced a finger over the 3 figures. One tall, 2 small, all holding hands. A vehicle approaching broke his reverie. Mrs. Holloway's station wagon came into view, right on schedule. Thomas had known she would come today, yet the sight of her car sent an unexpected jolt of anxiety through him. 2 weeks. The agreement had been clear. Inside, he heard the twins stirring, their whispered morning conversations a now familiar sound. They knew Mrs. Holloway was coming to discuss their future. Thomas had explained it as simply as he could, though he'd avoided definitive statements about what would happen next. The truth was, he didn't know. Mrs. Holloway emerged from her car looking exactly as she had 2 weeks prior, crisp, efficient, determined. But her expression softened when she spotted the mug in Thomas's hands. "I see they've made themselves at home," she observed, climbing the porch steps. Thomas set the mug aside. "They've been good girls, and how has it been for you?" she asked, studying his face. "Having children in your life after so long alone?" Before Thomas could formulate a response, the front door opened and the twins appeared, dressed in their best clothes, hair neatly braided. Their solemn expression suggested they understood exactly what today's visit meant. "Mrs. Holloway," they greeted in unison. "Good morning, girls," she replied warmly. "You're looking well, healthy. Mr. Blackhawk makes sure we eat vegetables," Mia reported earnestly. "And we get fresh air every day." Thomas felt a flicker of amusement at her recitation. "Clearly designed to present their living situation in the best possible light. I'm glad to hear it," Mrs. Holloway said. "Would you mind if I speak with Mr. Blackhawk alone for a few minutes?" The twins hesitated, exchanging an anxious glance, but eventually nodded and retreated inside. Though Thomas noticed they left the door slightly ajar, Mrs. Holloway took a seat in the chair beside Thomas's. "I'll be direct. The state orphanage in Phoenix remains overcrowded. No suitable foster families have been identified who would take both girls." Thomas waited, sensing there was more. "However," she continued, "there are concerns about this arrangement." She pulled a folder from her handbag, opening it to reveal a stack of official-looking papers. "School enrollment forms," she explained. "The state requires all children to receive proper education." Thomas frowned. "The school in town is 5 miles away," which presents a logistical challenge, certainly, Mrs. Holloway agreed, but not an insurmountable one. "There's also the matter of your qualifications as a guardian," meaning. Mrs. Holloway sighed, her professional demeanor slipping slightly. "Thomas, I'll be honest. You're a single man with no experience raising children, living in relative isolation. The girls need socialization, education, feminine influence. They've been well cared for," Thomas said, an edge entering his voice. "I can see that," she acknowledged. "They appear healthy and, frankly, happier than when I first brought them. But temporary emergency placement and long-term guardianship are very different matters." Thomas stared out at the ranch that had been his solitary domain for 3 decades. 2 weeks ago, the thought of permanently sharing it with children would have been unthinkable. Now, what happens if they go to the state home? He asked. "They'll receive basic care, education, and eventually the state will attempt to place them separately, as that's more likely to result in adoption." Separate them? The thought struck Thomas with unexpected force. "They need each other," Mrs. Holloway nodded, something like approval flickering in her eyes. "Yes, they do. Which is why I'm willing to recommend an extension of their stay here, with conditions." She handed Thomas the enrollment forms. "These must be completed. The girls must attend school regularly. Monthly check-ins with my office will be required. And you'll need to demonstrate that you're providing not just physical necessities, but appropriate guidance." Thomas looked at the papers with their official seals and complicated language. They represented something he hadn't allowed himself to contemplate, a future where the twins remained in his care. "How long?" he asked. "This extension, 3 months initially. Then we reassess." The front door creaked open further, revealing the twins' anxious faces. They'd clearly been listening to every word. "Can we stay?" Pia asked, her voice small but hopeful. Mrs. Holloway looked at Thomas, waiting for his response. 2 weeks ago, he'd been counting the days until his solitude would be restored. But something had shifted, gradually and then suddenly, like spring meltwater finally breaking through winter ice. The thought of the cabin returning to silence, of meals alone, of no small hands reaching for his when something frightened them. It felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "Yes," he said, the word emerging more gruffly than intended. "If you want to." The twins' reaction was immediate, pure joy breaking across their faces like sunrise. They rushed onto the porch, stopping just short of embracing him, their natural exuberance tempered by their still-evolving understanding of his boundaries. Mrs. Holloway smiled, clearly pleased despite her professional reservations. "I'll need those forms by next week, and we'll discuss arrangements for school transportation." After she departed, Thomas found himself alone on the porch with the twins, the enrollment forms resting heavily in his hands. The reality of what he'd committed to began sinking in. School schedules, new routines, increased interaction with the town that had made its judgment of him clear. "We'll be good," Mia promised earnestly. "We'll help with everything, and we'll learn really fast at school," Pia added. "Grandmother taught us reading already." Thomas looked at them, really looked at them, and saw not just two orphaned children, but Mia and Pia. Individuals with distinct personalities who had somehow worked their way into his carefully constructed solitude. "We have rules to follow now," he said, holding up the forms. "All of us." Later that evening, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, carefully filling out the school enrollment forms by lamplight. Each box required information he'd never needed to consider before. Emergency contacts, medical history, previous schooling. From their bedroom came the sound of quiet singing, their nightly ritual that had once irritated him, but now signaled that all was right in their small world. The painted mug sat beside him, its childish artwork more meaningful than any fine craftsmanship could have been. "Our home," it declared with simple certainty. Perhaps, Thomas thought as he signed his name as legal guardian, it could be. The October afternoon stretched golden across the ranch as Thomas worked to repair a section of corral fencing. School had been in session for 2 weeks now, with Hank Miller volunteering to drive the twins each morning on his postal route and Thomas collecting them each afternoon. The new routine had been an adjustment for all of them, but the girls seemed to be thriving on the structure and socialization. "I'll be back before sundown," Thomas called toward the cabin, where the twins were supposedly doing their homework. "Stay inside until I return." He received no answer, but that wasn't unusual. The girls often became absorbed in their studies or quiet games, creating their own private world between them. The broken fence section was nearly a mile from the house, requiring Thomas to take his tools and supplies by horseback. The damage wasn't severe, likely caused by one of the younger steers testing its strength, but with winter approaching, every repair became more urgent. As he worked, Thomas found himself planning dinner, mentally checking if he had enough potatoes to make the twins' favorite dish. Such considerations had become second nature over the past month, his solitary mindset gradually expanding to include the needs and preferences of two small, dependent beings. The sun was beginning its descent when Thomas completed the repair. Satisfied with his work, he packed his tools and mounted his horse for the ride home. A cool breeze carried the scent of sage and the first hint of coming frost. Winter would arrive early this year. He could feel it in the air. The cabin came into view as he crested the hill, smoke rising steadily from the chimney. The twins must have added wood to the fire, as he'd taught them. Another small sign of their growing capability and integration into ranch life. What Thomas noticed next sent ice through his veins, the padlock on his storage shed hanging open, the door slightly ajar. He spurred his horse forward, covering the remaining distance at a gallop. The shed contained dangerous tools, old hunting gear, items the twins had been explicitly forbidden to touch, had they ignored his most important rule. The thought kindled anger, but also fear for their safety. Thomas dismounted before his horse fully stopped, striding toward the cabin with a mixture of concern and frustration. The front door swung open as he approached, revealing Mia's worried face. "What were you doing in the storage shed?" he demanded without preamble. Mia's expression crumpled into guilt. "We didn't—" "Don't lie to me," Thomas interrupted, his voice sharper than intended. "The padlock is open." Before Mia could respond, Thomas spotted something on the kitchen table that stopped him cold, a rectangular wooden box he recognized instantly. His private box, the one containing all he had left of his former life. Pia emerged from the girl's bedroom, freezing when she saw Thomas's expression. In her hand was an old silver-framed photograph. "We found a key," she admitted in a small voice. "In the book on your nightstand. You went through my room?" Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet now. The twins exchanged a glance that contained their silent communication, apparently deciding honesty was their only option. "We wanted to know more about you," Mia explained. "About your family? You had no right," Thomas said, crossing to Pia and taking the photograph from her hand. He glanced at it briefly. His wife Sarah's smiling face, his own younger self, looking carefree in a way that now seemed to belong to another person entirely. Taken just weeks before her death in childbirth, along with their infant son. "She's beautiful," Pia whispered. "Was she your wife?" Thomas placed the photo face down on the table, unable to look at it. "This is private, all of it. You had no right to go through my things. But we're supposed to be a family," Mia protested, her practical nature asserting itself even in the face of his anger. "Families know about each other." "We are not a family," Thomas snapped, instantly regretting the words as hurt bloomed across the twins' identical faces. But something had broken loose inside him, grief long buried, memories he'd spent decades carefully avoiding. He snatched up the wooden box, closing it with finality. "Go to your room, both of you." The twins retreated without argument. The door to their bedroom, closing with a quiet click that somehow cut deeper than a slam would have. Thomas stood alone in the kitchen, the wooden box clutched against his chest like a shield. Inside were the remnants of a different life, wedding photos, his wife's favorite scarf, the tiny knitted cap meant for their son, papers from the life insurance that had paid for this ranch. A life he'd sealed away when he'd buried his wife and child. The afternoon light faded as Thomas remained motionless, caught between past and present. Eventually, he placed the box on the kitchen table and opened it fully. Confronting its contents for the first time in years, Sarah's face smiled up at him from multiple photographs. Their wedding day, a camping trip to the mountains, her standing proudly outside the classroom where she taught second grade. The last photo showed her 7 months pregnant, radiant with anticipation for a future that would never arrive. Complications during delivery had taken both her and their son. A loss so complete, it had broken something fundamental in Thomas. He'd retreated to this remote ranch, closed himself off from humanity, built walls that had stood unbreached for 30 years, until 2 small girls had arrived at his door. As darkness fell outside, Thomas became aware of the silence from the twins' room. No whispered conversations, no quiet singing. Just silence heavy with unspoken hurt. He'd been unfair, he knew. Their curiosity was natural, their desire to understand him reasonable. They'd crossed a boundary, yes, but perhaps it was a boundary that needed crossing. Thomas carefully returned the photographs to the box, leaving out only one, Sarah, on their wedding day. After a moment's consideration, he knocked gently on the twins' door. "Come in," Mia's voice, subdued and wary. Thomas entered, finding them sitting side by side on the bed, eyes red-rimmed but dry. Their posture held the same resigned dignity he'd observed when they'd first arrived. Expecting rejection, he sat on the edge of the bed, the wedding photo in his hands. "Her name was Sarah," he began, his voice rough with disuse. "She was a teacher. She loved wild roses and thunderstorms and children's stories. We were married for 3 years before—" Thomas faltered, but made himself continue. "Before she died having our baby, a boy. He died too." The twins listened with solemn attention, understanding in their young faces that went beyond their years. "I'm sorry we looked at your private things," Mia said finally. "I'm sorry I shouted," Thomas replied. "Some memories are Difficult. Like the fire, Pia said quietly. We don't remember it much, but sometimes I have bad dreams. Thomas nodded. Suddenly seeing their shared experience in a new light, all three of them shaped by losses they rarely spoke of. Would you like to see more pictures? He offered. I could tell you about her. The twins nodded eagerly, their faces brightening at this unexpected opening. That night, Thomas shared pieces of his past he'd thought would remain forever locked away. The twins listened, asked questions, and eventually shared their own fragmented memories of parents who'd existed in their lives for too brief a time. When they finally fell asleep, Thomas carefully returned the photographs to his box, but left it on the kitchen table rather than hiding it away again. Some barriers once broken shouldn't be rebuilt. Outside, beneath the vast Arizona sky, the first stars appeared, constant, unchanging, witnessing the slow healing of three broken hearts, finding their way towards something new. The sharp knock on the door came just after noon on a Tuesday. Thomas had kept the twins home from school with slight colds, nothing serious, but enough to warrant a day of rest. They were seated at the kitchen table, Mia practicing her handwriting, while Pia colored a picture of Thunder, the Mustang who now came running whenever she called. Thomas wasn't expecting visitors. Hank had made his delivery yesterday, and Mrs. Holloway wasn't due for her monthly check-in until next week. Setting down the pot of soup he'd been stirring, Thomas moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtains. A county car sat in the yard, its official seal gleaming on the door. Beside it stood two people, a tall woman in a severe suit and a younger man with a clipboard. Their posture radiated official business. Who is it? Mia asked, noticing Thomas's sudden stillness. Stay inside, he instructed, his tone making it clear this was not a request to be questioned. The twins exchanged worried glances, but remained seated as Thomas stepped onto the porch. Closing the door firmly behind him, Mr. Blackhawk? The woman extended her hand. I'm Margaret Wells, Child Welfare Services. This is my colleague, David Chen. Thomas nodded curtly but didn't take her offered hand. What can I do for you? Ms. Wells withdrew her hand smoothly, as if the rejection was expected. We're here concerning Mia and Pia Wilson. We've received a report expressing concern about their living situation. What kind of concern? Thomas asked, his voice level despite the sudden chill in his veins. May we come inside? This would be better discussed privately. We can talk here, Thomas insisted, unwilling to subject the twins to whatever this was. Ms. Wells pursed her lips but nodded. Very well. We've received an anonymous report alleging improper guardianship, specifically concerns about cultural suppression, inadequate feminine influence, and educational neglect. The girls attend school regularly, Thomas countered, anger beginning to simmer beneath his calm exterior. Their teacher can confirm it. Yes, we've spoken with Ms. Richards, Ms. Wells acknowledged. She reports they're doing well academically. However, there are broader concerns about their developmental needs. Mr. Chen finally spoke up, his voice gentler than his colleagues. Mr. Blackhawk, this is a preliminary inquiry only. We're required to investigate all reports concerning children in non-traditional placements. From his briefcase, Chen produced an official document with multiple pages and a state seal. This is a formal notification of our investigation. We'll need to conduct a home evaluation and interview the children. Thomas accepted the papers without looking at them, his attention focused on keeping his expression neutral. Inside, his thoughts raced. Who had filed the report? Someone in town, certainly. Someone who believed Apache men shouldn't raise white children. The girls have colds today, he said finally. They need rest. We still need to see them briefly, Ms. Wells insisted, to confirm their well-being. Before Thomas could respond, the door opened behind him. Mia stepped onto the porch, her posture straight despite her slightly reddened nose. We're fine, she announced with the dignity of someone twice her age. Mr. Blackhawk takes very good care of us. Ms. Wells smiled professionally. Hello, Mia, or is it Pia? I'm Mia, she answered. Pia's inside. She doesn't like strangers much. Smart girl, Thomas thought with grim approval. Could we speak with you privately, Mia? Miss Wells asked. Just for a few minutes. Mia glanced at Thomas, who gave her the slightest nod. She'd speak with them regardless. Better she knew he approved. You can talk to me here, Mia stated, unconsciously echoing Thomas's earlier stance. Mr. Chen crouched to her eye level, his manner kind. We just want to make sure you and your sister are happy here. Do you feel safe? Are you getting everything you need? Yes, Mia answered without hesitation. We have good food and warm beds and books from school. And Thunder, that's our horse. Well, Mr. Blackhawk's horse, but he lets us help with him. Miss Wells made notes on her clipboard. And what about friends? Do you play with other children? At school, Mia answered. And church on Sundays. Thomas kept his expression neutral, though this was news to him. The twins had never mentioned wanting to attend church. Another adaptation they'd made, without burdening him with the request. Mr. Blackhawk takes you to church. Miss Wells asked, her tone suggesting skepticism. Mrs. Miller does, Mia clarified. She picks us up on Sundays. Mr. Blackhawk said it was all right if we wanted to go. Another note on the clipboard. And what do you do when you're not in school? Does Mr. Blackhawk teach you about your cultural heritage? Mia looked confused. What do you mean? Your family background, Miss Wells clarified. Your traditions. Grandmother taught us her recipes, Mia offered. Mr. Blackhawk tells us Apache stories sometimes. About First Man and the animals. This exchange continued for several minutes, with Mia answering each question directly and honestly. Thomas remained silent, letting her speak for herself, though he noted how skillfully Miss Wells guided the conversation toward potential deficiencies in his guardianship. Finally, Miss Wells straightened. Thank you, Mia. You've been very helpful. We'd like to speak with Pia as well. She's resting, Thomas interjected firmly. This won't take long, Miss Wells insisted. Before the standoff could escalate, the door opened again and Pia emerged, clutching a small object in her hands. I'm here, she said quietly. Thomas noticed she was holding her turquoise bead, the one she believed helped her communicate with animals. Her talisman against uncertainty. The questioning began again, with Pia's answers matching her sister's in substance, if not in confidence. Thomas watched the officials' faces, trying to gauge their reactions, but both remained professionally unreadable. When they had finished, Mr. Chen handed Thomas another document. This schedules a formal home evaluation for next Tuesday. We'll need to inspect the living conditions more thoroughly and conduct a more comprehensive interview. We'll also need you to provide character references, Ms. Wells added. People who can speak to your fitness as a guardian. After they departed, Thomas stood on the porch holding the official papers, watching until their car disappeared down the long driveway. The twins waited silently beside him, sensing his tension. Are they going to take us away? Pia finally asked, her voice small. Thomas looked down at the documents in his hands. Formal, impersonal pages that somehow held the power to shatter the fragile structure the three of them had been building. No, he said with more certainty than he felt. They're not taking you anywhere. Mia, ever practical, asked the question Thomas had been asking himself. Who told them about us? Who made the report? Thomas folded the papers carefully. Someone who doesn't understand. Understand what? Pia pressed. Thomas placed a hand briefly on each of their shoulders, a gesture that had once felt awkward, but now came naturally. That families don't all look the same, he answered. But that doesn't make them any less real. The word family hung in the air between them, acknowledged for the first time without qualification or hesitation. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Thomas realized, they would face them not as guardian and wards, but as a unit forged by choice rather than blood. The official papers crackled in his grip, a reminder that some battles couldn't be avoided. But Thomas Blackhawk had faced enemies before, in war, in prejudice, in grief. He would not surrender this newfound purpose without a fight. The morning after the welfare official's visit, Thomas drove into town alone. He'd asked Hank to stay with the twins, an arrangement the postman had readily agreed to, his weathered face creasing with concern when Thomas explained the situation. People ought to mind their own business, Hank had muttered. Those girls are thriving with you. Now Thomas parked outside Wilson's general store, steeling himself for the conversations ahead. He needed allies, respectable community members willing to vouch for his character and guardianship. It meant swallowing his pride, asking for help from a community he'd deliberately kept at arm's length for decades. Inside, Sam Wilson looked up in surprise. Thomas rarely came to town, and never without the twins these days. Morning Black Hawk, Sam greeted cautiously. "Everything all right?" Thomas nodded curtly. "Need to talk to you, Sam. Private matter." Sam's eyebrows rose, but he gestured toward his small office at the back of the store. "Betty, watch the counter," he called to his wife before leading Thomas to the cramped room filled with inventory records and yellowing ledgers. On Sam's desk sat a clipboard holding several sheets of paper. Thomas recognized it immediately, a petition. The top sheet bore a handwritten heading, "Regarding the Wilson twins' placement." "I see word travels fast," Thomas commented, nodding toward the clipboard. Sam had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Edith Palmer started it yesterday. Been bringing it around to businesses on Main Street. May I?" Thomas reached for the petition. Sam hesitated but pushed it across the desk. "Not everyone signed it, Thomas. The petition was straightforward in its prejudice. We, the undersigned residents of Cooperton, express concern regarding the placement of the Wilson twin girls with Thomas Blackhawk. While Mr. Blackhawk is known to be self-sufficient, we believe the cultural and social development of these orphaned white children would be better served in a traditional family environment." Thomas scanned the signatures. About 20 names, including several of the town's more prominent citizens. His jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral as he set the clipboard down. "Child welfare was out yesterday," he said simply. "Anonymous report," Sam winced. "Not so anonymous in a town this size." "I need character references," Thomas continued. "People willing to speak for me." "That's a big ask in Cooperton," Sam replied honestly. "I know." Sam studied Thomas for a long moment. "Those girls mean something to you, don't they?" "Not just a responsibility you got stuck with." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "They're family now." The simple declaration hung in the air between them. Finally, Sam nodded. "I'll be a reference. Betty, too, if you need her. The twins always seem happy and well cared for when you bring them in." "Thank you," Thomas said, the words feeling strange in his mouth after so many years of self-reliance. "Who else you planning to ask?" Sam inquired. "Sheriff Watson," Thomas answered. "Figure a lawman's word carries weight." Sam looked skeptical. "Watson's traditional, Thomas. Might not be your best ally in this." "He's fair," Thomas countered. "That's all I need." As Thomas left the store, he noticed Edith Palmer watching from across the street, her expression openly curious. News of his visit to Sam would circulate before noon, he knew. In a town the size of Cooperton, nothing remained private for long. The sheriff's office was his next stop. Watson was at his desk, reviewing paperwork with his reading glasses perched precariously on his nose. He looked up as Thomas entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Blackhawk," he acknowledged. "Figured I'd be seeing you." "Then you've heard," Thomas said, taking the seat across from him. "Hard not to." Watson removed his glasses. "Small town, big opinions." Thomas got straight to the point. "I need to know where you stand, Sheriff." Watson sighed heavily. "Officially, I stay neutral on civil matters. Unofficially—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I've known you 30 years, Thomas. You're a man of your word who keeps to himself and follows the law. Never given me a minute's trouble, but," Thomas prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation, "but raising children is different from ranching, especially girls. Especially when—" He trailed off. "When they're white and I'm Apache," Thomas finished flatly. Watson had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Some folks around here hold to old ways of thinking. And you?" The sheriff rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "My grandmother was quarter Cherokee. Never talked about it much. Times were different then. But she taught me something worth remembering. Character isn't about the color of your skin or your background. It's about how you treat people when it counts." He leaned forward. "Those girls look healthy. They're doing well in school, according to Marge Richards. They speak of you with respect and even affection. That tells me more than any petition." Relief washed through Thomas, though he kept his expression neutral. "Then you'll serve as a reference?" "I'll tell the welfare folks what I've observed," Watson agreed. "Nothing more, nothing less." As Thomas rose to leave, Watson added, "You should know, this petition isn't the only one circulating." Thomas paused. "Meaning?" "Hank Miller's wife started a counter-petition, supporting you keeping the girls. It's got nearly as many signatures as Edith's." This information caught Thomas by surprise. He hadn't realized he had that much support in the community. "The town split right down the middle on this," Watson continued. "And the twins are caught in between." Outside, Thomas stood for a moment on the sidewalk, processing what he'd learned. The community had drawn its lines, with him and the twins at the center of the division. It wasn't a position he'd ever sought, having spent decades avoiding being the focus of attention. His next stop was the school, where Miss Richards agreed without hesitation to provide a reference. "Those girls are a joy to teach," she told him warmly. "So eager to learn, so considerate of others. Whatever you're doing at home, Mr. Blackhawk, it's working." By noon, Thomas had secured 5 references, not as many as he'd hoped, but more than he'd expected. As he walked back to his truck, he passed the church where Reverend Matthews was tending the small garden out front. The minister straightened as Thomas approached. They'd had little interaction over the years, with Thomas avoiding organized religion as thoroughly as he avoided most community functions. "Mr. Blackhawk," Reverend Matthews greeted him. "I've been hoping to speak with you." Thomas nodded cautiously. "The twins have been attending our Sunday school regularly," the minister continued. "Delightful girls. Mrs. Miller brings them each week." "So I've heard," Thomas acknowledged. Reverend Matthews hesitated, then added, "I understand you're facing some community concern regarding their placement with you." Thomas tensed. "Preparing for another judgment. I want you to know," the minister said carefully, "that my wife and I would be happy to provide a reference on your behalf. The girls speak very highly of you, and their spiritual and moral development appears to be proceeding beautifully." The unexpected support momentarily left Thomas speechless. Finally he managed, "Thank you, Reverend." "Faith comes in many forms, Mr. Blackhawk," Reverend Matthews said with a gentle smile, "and family is sacred in all of them." Driving home, Thomas reflected on the day's revelations. The community wasn't uniformly against him, as he'd assumed. For every Edith Palmer collecting signatures opposing his guardianship, there was a Hank Miller gathering support. For every prejudiced viewpoint, there was someone willing to judge based on what they observed rather than what they assumed. The twins were waiting anxiously on the porch when he arrived home, their faces lighting up at the sight of his truck. As they ran to greet him, Thomas felt a fierce protectiveness that transcended blood ties or cultural expectations. These girls were his family now, and he would fight with every resource available to keep them safe, including accepting help from a community he'd never truly allowed himself to be part of until now. 3 days remained until the formal home inspection. The cabin had never been cleaner. Floors scrubbed, windows polished, everything organized with military precision. The twins had thrown themselves into the preparations with anxious energy, understanding more than Thomas had explained about the stakes involved. In the girls' bedroom, a colorful paper calendar hung on the wall. Made from construction paper and adorned with crayon drawings, it showed the current month with certain dates circled in red. The most prominent circles surrounded the upcoming Tuesday, Inspection Day, with small X marks crossing off each completed day leading up to it. "Do you think they'll ask us more questions?" Mia asked as Thomas helped her hang freshly laundered curtains in the main room. "Probably," he answered honestly. "Just tell the truth like before." Mia nodded solemnly. "Pia's been practicing her answers at night. She gets nervous around strangers." Thomas paused in his work. "She doesn't need to practice. They just want to see that you're both safe and happy here." "We are," Mia insisted. "Happier than the church home where we stayed after grandmother died. The ladies there were nice, but they had so many children to care for." Nobody had time to listen. The simple statement caught Thomas off guard. These girls had experienced more loss in their young lives than many adults, yet they retained a remarkable resilience. "I listen," he said quietly. Mia smiled up at him. "That's why we want to stay." Outside, Pia was in the vegetable garden with Hank Miller, who had become a regular visitor since the welfare official's first appearance. Together, they were clearing the last storm-damaged plants and preparing the soil for winter. "Looking good out there," Thomas observed, joining them. "Garden will be ready for spring planting." Hank straightened, rubbing his lower back. "Should produce well next year with this soil amendment. The girls showed me that trick with the eggshells their grandmother taught them." "Smart thinking." Pia beamed at the praise. Her usual shyness diminished around Hank, who had a gift for putting children at ease. "Mail came," Hank said, reaching into his pocket. "Including this." He handed Thomas an official-looking envelope from the county courthouse. Thomas opened it with steady hands, though his heart raced. Inside was a formal notice of hearing. 2 weeks after the home inspection, he was required to appear before a family court judge who would review the welfare recommendation and make a final determination about the twins' placement. "Bad?" Hank asked, noting Thomas's expression. "Court hearing," Thomas replied, tucking the notice into his pocket before Pia could see it. 2 weeks after the inspection, Hank nodded grimly. "Edith and her crowd pushed for it, I'd wager. Not satisfied, leaving it to the welfare office. Will you come inside for coffee?" Thomas asked, changing the subject for Pia's benefit. "There's something I want to discuss." At the kitchen table, while the twins worked in their bedroom on what they'd described mysteriously as a special project, Thomas showed Hank the court notice. "I need legal advice," he admitted. "Know anyone?" Hank considered this. "Judge Burnett retired last year. Lives outside town on that small horse property. He might consult, off the record. Would he help someone like me?" Thomas asked bluntly. Hank's expression softened. "Thomas, you got more friends than you realize. Not everyone in town sees the world like Edith Palmer." After Hank departed, Thomas found himself drawn to the twins' room by the sound of their excited whispers. He knocked gently on the half-open door. "Can I see this special project?" The girls exchanged glances before Mia nodded. "It's for the inspection," she explained, gesturing him in. On their small desk lay several sheets of construction paper covered in careful drawings and neatly written labels. Thomas recognized the ranch, the cabin, the barn, the corral with horses. Each building was labeled, with small figures representing the 3 of them engaged in various activities. "It's our home," Pia explained shyly. "To show them we belong here." Thomas studied the drawings, noting the detailed touches, the vegetable garden with labeled plants, Thunder in his special stall. Even the rabbit they'd rescued now, shown in a hutch Thomas had built last week. "Ms. Richards helped us start it at school," Mia added. "She said visual aids are good for presentations." The earnestness of their efforts tightened something in Thomas's chest. These children were fighting for a home in the only ways they knew how. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Sheriff Watson's patrol car pulling up alongside a pickup. Truck Thomas recognized as belonging to Sam Wilson. "We came to help," Sam announced without preamble as Thomas met them on the porch. "Betty sent paint for the girls' room, and I've got lumber to fix that sagging porch step." Thomas hesitated, unaccustomed to accepting help. "You don't need to." "Yes, we do," Sheriff Watson interrupted. "Those welfare folks will be looking for any excuse. Might as well not give them one with easy fixes." Throughout the day, more visitors arrived. Reverend Matthews and his wife bringing curtains for the main room. Ms. Richards with children's books to expand the twins' small collection. Even Dr. Peterson, who rarely made house calls, offering to update the twins' medical records. "Community looks after its own," the doctor explained simply when Thomas expressed surprise at his appearance. As Thomas watched these people, many of whom he'd barely spoken to in decades, work alongside the twins to improve their home, he felt something shift within him. The isolation he'd cultivated for so long had become a prison of his own making, one that these 2 small girls had somehow unlocked. That evening, After everyone had departed and the twins were asleep, Thomas sat alone on the newly repaired porch steps. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Arizona sky like diamonds on black velvet. He thought about the approaching inspection, the court hearing that would follow, the possibility of losing this newfound family he'd never sought, but now couldn't imagine living without. For 30 years, he'd survived by keeping the world at a distance. Now his best hope lay in embracing the very community connections he'd spent decades avoiding. From inside came the soft sound of Pia whimpering in her sleep, the nightmares that occasionally still troubled her. Thomas rose without hesitation and went to her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder until she settled, never fully waking. "It's all right," he murmured. "You're home. You're safe." And in that moment, Thomas made a silent vow beneath the watching stars. Whatever it took, whatever personal barriers he needed to break, he would ensure these children remained where they belonged. With him, in the home they had created together, the countdown calendar on their wall marked the dwindling days until the inspection. But beyond that loomed the court date that would determine their future. Thomas touched the paper calendar gently, tracing the twins' hopeful markings. Some battles couldn't be fought alone. Thomas Blackhawk, who had stood apart for most of his life, now found himself at the center of a community effort. And strangely, it felt like coming home in a way he hadn't experienced since his youth on the reservation. The last Apache of Broken Feather Ranch was no longer alone. The county courthouse stood imposingly in the center of the county seat, a 30-mile drive from Cooperton. Built of red brick with white columns, it represented a formality and officialdom far removed from the simple life of Broken Feather Ranch. Thomas parked his truck, freshly washed for the occasion, and helped the twins down from the passenger seat. They were dressed in their best, new outfits purchased specifically for today with Hank's wife's guidance. Identical blue dresses with white collars, their hair neatly braided with matching ribbons. Thomas himself wore the only suit he owned, purchased decades ago for his wedding and carefully preserved since then. "Remember," he told them quietly, "just answer honestly. Don't try to guess what they want to hear." The twins nodded solemnly, their usual chatter subdued by the gravity of the occasion. In Mia's hands was a large manila envelope containing their school artwork, drawings of life at the ranch, their family, always including Thomas, and carefully written stories about their daily activities. Inside the courthouse, they found a small crowd already gathered in the hallway outside Courtroom B, supporters and opponents alike. Sam and Betty Wilson nodded encouragingly. Sheriff Watson stood conversing quietly with Judge Burnett, who had agreed to advise Thomas informally. Ms. Richards smiled warmly at the twins, and on the opposite side of the hallway, Edith Palmer sat stiffly with several other townspeople, their expressions ranging from concern to outright disapproval. "Quite the turnout," observed Mrs. Holloway, approaching them. As the twins' initial caseworker, she would be testifying today. "How are you feeling, girls?" "Nervous," Mia admitted while Pia pressed closer to Thomas's side. "That's understandable," Mrs. Holloway assured them. "But remember, everyone here wants what's best for you." Thomas wasn't entirely convinced of that, but he appreciated her attempt to comfort the girls. A bailiff appeared at the courtroom door. "Black Hawk guardianship hearing," he announced. "All parties may enter." The courtroom was smaller than Thomas had imagined, with well-worn wooden benches and a judge's bench that seemed designed to intimidate by height alone. Ms. Wells and Mr. Chen from Child Welfare Services were already seated at one table, surrounded by files and paperwork. Thomas and the twins were directed to the opposite table, joined by Judge Burnett, who had agreed at the last minute to formally represent them. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. As Judge Harrison entered, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, the proceedings began with formal introductions and statements. Miss Wells presented the Child Welfare Services recommendation first, a carefully worded report that acknowledged the twins' apparent well-being, but expressed significant concerns about cultural integration. female influence, and long-term social development. She recommended the twins be placed in the state home, while more suitable permanent placement with a traditional family is arranged. Throughout her presentation, Thomas kept his expression carefully neutral, though inside he seethed at the thinly veiled prejudice couched in professional terminology. Judge Burnett presented their case next, his decades of legal experience evident in his measured tone and strategic emphasis. He outlined Thomas's background: decorated veteran, responsible property owner, reliable community member, and detailed the improvements made to accommodate the twins' needs. He introduced the character references one by one, with each person standing briefly when named. Furthermore, Judge Burnett continued, the academic and social progress of Mia and Pia Wilson during their time with Mr. Blackhawk has been exemplary, as their teacher, Ms. Richards, will testify. They are participating in community activities, including church functions, and have shown every sign of healthy adjustment despite their previous trauma. The testimony phase began with Ms. Wells calling her witnesses. Several townspeople expressed concerns about Thomas's suitability as a guardian, though under Judge Burnett's cross-examination, most admitted they had limited personal interaction with Thomas or the twins. Edith Palmer was particularly vocal. It simply isn't natural, she insisted. Those girls need a mother figure, proper cultural upbringing. Mr. Blackhawk lives too remotely, and his background is different. Different how, specifically? Judge Burnett pressed. Edith faltered momentarily. Well, his customs, his heritage. The girls are from a traditional American family, and Native Americans aren't traditional Americans. Judge Burnett asked mildly. When Judge Burnett presented their witnesses, a different picture emerged. Ms. Richards testified to the twins' excellent academic progress and social integration at school. Sheriff Watson spoke to Thomas's character and the positive changes he'd observed in recent months. Those girls were withdrawn, fearful when they first arrived in town, the sheriff stated. Now they're confident, engaged. Whatever Thomas Blackhawk is doing, it's working. Mrs. Holloway's testimony proved surprisingly supportive. In my 30 years of child placement work, she told the court, I've learned to recognize genuine bonds when I see them. The attachment between Mr. Blackhawk and these children is authentic and healthy. Throughout the proceedings, Thomas noticed the twins growing unease. Pia trembled slightly, while Mia clutched her envelope of drawings. During a recess, Thomas bent close. You're both doing fine, he whispered. Almost over now. Can I show the judge our pictures? Mia asked. Thomas glanced at Judge Burnett, who nodded. When we return, I'll ask. When the hearing resumed, the girls were invited to speak. Mia stepped forward, Pia close behind. Your Honor, we made these to show you our home. She opened the envelope. Drawings of Broken Feather Ranch, labeled buildings, chores, animals, schoolwork. Mr. Blackhawk teaches us to be honest and brave, Mia explained. And tells Apache stories, Pia added softly. About respecting the earth. Judge Harrison studied each page. Very well done. You notice details. That's what Mr. Blackhawk says too, Mia replied. Do you feel safe with him? The judge asked. Yes, they said together. And when you're afraid, he sits with us until we feel better, Pia said clearly. He never gets angry. Would you like to stay with him? He's our family now, Mia answered. The only one we have left, Pia whispered. Later, Judge Harrison delivered her decision. The best interest of the children guides this court. The evidence shows they have formed a secure attachment to Mr. Blackhawk. I grant him temporary guardianship for 1 year, with review for permanence. Relief surged through Thomas as the twins pressed against him. Conditions, schooling, welfare visits, community involvement, barely registered. Opponents like Edith Palmer left grim-faced. But for Thomas and the twins, the battle was won. Outside, autumn sunlight shone as the girls skipped beside him. For the first time in months, Thomas allowed himself simple joy. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. 6 months later, spring brought wildflowers to Broken Feather Ranch. The twins tended a thriving garden while adoption forms waited on Thomas's desk. After long talks with the girls, he'd signed his name with deliberate care, one step from temporary guardianship to forever. Family forever, Pia had said simply, capturing everything the papers meant. That evening by the fire, Thomas brought out a small carved box, etched with Apache symbols and patterns from the girls' drawings. Inside lay the adoption papers, 2 silver bands, and a folded page. "I've signed the papers to adopt you," he said. "If that's what you still want." The twins' joyous embrace left him wordless. When they calmed, he gave them the bands, each engraved inside with one word: family. Finally, he unfolded the paper. In Apache, this word means home, family, and belonging all at once. Go gay. The girls repeated it softly, reverently. "Yes," Thomas said, smiling. "That's who we are now." Later, after the twins had gone to bed, still whispering excitedly about the adoption and their new Apache word, Thomas sat alone on the porch beneath a sky brilliant with stars. The night air carried the scent of sage and pine, the familiar fragrances of the land that had been his solitary domain for so long. Except it wasn't solitary anymore. The cabin behind him held breathing, dreaming children who had transformed his life as surely as he had transformed theirs. The ranch was no longer just a place of retreat and isolation, but a home in the fullest sense of the word. From the twins' room came the soft sound of their nightly singing, a lullaby their grandmother had taught them, now blended with fragments of Apache melodies Thomas had shared. The harmonious mingling of traditions symbolized what they had created together, something new yet rooted, unique yet connected to what had come before. Tomorrow, Thomas would take the adoption papers to town for filing. There would be more visits from officials, more questions, perhaps even more opposition from those like Edith Palmer, who remained convinced that families should follow predictable patterns. But tonight, under the vast Arizona sky, Thomas Blackhawk, the last Apache of his line, knew with unshakable certainty that he was no longer the last of anything. He was the first of something new, a family formed not through blood, but through choice and love, and the daily work of caring. "Go-gay," he whispered to the stars. The word both prayer and promise, home, family, belonging, all contained in a single breath, just as his heart now contained multitudes where once there had been only echoing solitude. 1 year to the day after the twins had arrived at Broken Feather Ranch, Thomas stood at the end of the driveway with Mia and Pia beside him. The old weathered sign that had once simply announced "Cook Needed" lay at their feet, replaced now by a new cedar plank Thomas had carefully seasoned and sanded to a silky finish. The new sign, freshly painted in bold black letters with colorful decorative elements around the border, read Blackhawk Family Ranch. The twins had insisted on painting it themselves, their brushwork careful and deliberate, the result of many practice attempts on scrap wood. "Ready?" Thomas asked, holding out the hammer. The twins nodded eagerly, each taking hold of one side of the tool. Together, they drove the first nail into place, securing their handiwork to the sturdy posts Thomas had set the previous day. Official now, Mia declared with satisfaction as they stepped back to admire their work. The ranch had transformed over the past year, just as its inhabitants had. The garden had expanded to twice its original size. New chicken coops housed a growing flock. The barn had been repainted, its roof fully repaired. Inside the cabin, colorful curtains brightened the windows. Handmade quilts adorned the beds, and children's artwork decorated walls that had once been bare. But the physical changes paled beside the deeper transformation, the shift from isolation to connection, from solitude to family. "Remember when we first came?" Pia asked, her voice holding none of the shyness that had once characterized her speech. "You looked so scary." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Scary? Like a thundercloud," Mia confirmed with a giggle. "All dark and grumbly. Still grumbly sometimes," Thomas acknowledged, his tone lighter than would have been possible a year ago. They walked back toward the cabin together, the twins skipping ahead occasionally before circling back, their energy as boundless as ever. From the corral, Thunder nickered a greeting, now responding to all three of them, though still showing special deference to Pia. "Hank's coming for dinner tonight," Mia reminded them unnecessarily, as she'd been counting down to this celebration for days. "And Mrs. Richards and Reverend Matthews and—" "We remember," Thomas assured her, amused by her excitement. The small gathering to mark the anniversary of the twins' arrival had been their idea, though Thomas had agreed more readily than even he had expected. The community connections that had formed during their legal battle had deepened into genuine friendships, particularly with Hank and Sarah Miller. On the porch, Thomas paused, taking in the view that had been his solitary solace for 3 decades. The land remained the same, the rolling hills, the distant mountains, the vast sky overhead. But he saw it differently now, through the eyes of a man who had found an unexpected path back to human connection. Inside, the cabin welcomed them with the scent of baking bread. Mia had insisted on making her grandmother's recipe for the occasion. On the mantel above the fireplace stood photographs in simple frames. Sarah from Thomas's past, the twins' parents and grandmother, and newer images capturing life at the ranch. "Special day calls for a special story," Thomas said, as the twins bustled about, putting final touches on their preparations for the evening's guests. They settled onto the storytelling blanket, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing. Thomas began with traditional words he'd taught them, an Apache blessing for homes and new beginnings. The twins joined in for the parts they'd memorized, their pronunciation improving with each retelling. "Today's story is about 3 paths that became one," Thomas said. "About how sometimes the thing you think you want isn't what you truly need." He told their own story then, reimagined as a tale of ancient wisdom, about a solitary warrior who believed his strength lay in isolation, and 2 young travelers who showed him that true strength comes from connection. The twins listened raptly, recognizing their shared journey in the familiar metaphors, and the warrior learned that the family he never expected to have was the family he was always meant to find. Thomas concluded that some bonds aren't made by blood but by choice, by daily acts of care and courage, like us. Pia said softly. Thomas nodded. "Like us." The sound of vehicles approaching signaled their guest's arrival. As the twins rushed to the door, Thomas remained seated for a moment, letting gratitude wash through him. For 30 years, he had believed that peace came from separation, that safety lay in isolation. How wrong he had been. Last week, the final adoption papers had arrived, official confirmation of what they had known in their hearts for months. Mia and Pia Wilson were now legally Mia and Pia Blackhawk, their family bonds recognized by the same system that had once questioned their validity. Rising to greet their guests, Thomas caught sight of himself in the small mirror by the door. The face looking back at him was still weathered, still bearing the lines of past sorrows, but no longer closed. No longer the face of a man determined to keep the world at a distance. Outside, the new sign caught the golden light of the setting sun, its declaration both simple and profound. Blackhawk Family Ranch. 4 words that told the truth of what had happened here, how a man seeking only a cook and 2 girls seeking only shelter had found something infinitely more precious. 3 paths. Now one, 3 hearts, now a family. Through the open door, laughter spilled into the gathering dusk, the sound of a home filled with life, with connection, with belonging, with all that the Apache word goji promised and fulfilled. Thomas stepped outside to welcome his friends, leaving behind the silence that had once defined his existence. The last Apache of Broken Feather Ranch had found his way home at last, not to the past he couldn't reclaim, but to the future he never expected. A future bright with the voices of children who had shown an isolated man how to belong once more to the human family.